an ancient world, dating back to around 10,000 BCE, created by Poseidon. This level of execution and scale and grandeur is wild and outlandish even to us today, let alone when this was meant to have been built around 10,000 BCE. And it's no wonder that it's found its way into pop culture. Is it real? And if not, where does this legend come from? Hi guys, and welcome back to Hot History, your corner of the internet where we cover all the things in history that you probably should know, but don't. I'm Ainsley Harvey, your hot historian here, ready to chat about the myth, the legend, and the facts of the lost city of Atlantis. Now, I've been obsessed with Atlantis since I was a kid. Not in the least because Milo from Atlantis the Lost Empire is like an OG crush of mine, but also because of what it promised. An ancient world, dating back to around 10,000 BCE, created by Poseidon, god of the sea, to become a technological marvel with pure, almost superhuman inhabitants that were eventually swallowed by the sea, waiting for us to find it. It is incredible. And it's no wonder that it's found its way into pop culture, from The Little Mermaid to Aquaman. But the big question is it real? And if not, where does this legend come from? So to answer this question, we are rewinding it all the way back to 360 BCE today, the ancient world, around 9,000 years after Atlantis is meant to have sunk, with the man who started it all, Plato. Now guys, I am only going to say this once, and I'm doing it early on, so if you come for me in the comments about this, I will set the ghost of Napoleon on you, okay? I'm from Australia. Over here on our golden sunny shores, we say Plato, not Plato. So let's all get the funny hee-hees out of our system. Yes, when I say it, it sounds like the stuff kids play with at parties. So ready? 3, 2, 1.
R&R.
We're done. Thank you very much. Now, chances are you've heard of Plato before, but if not, totally fine. Again, this is the place for all the things in history you probably should know, but don't. So the quick download of what you need to know is Plato is one of the most famous philosophers in history and a key figure in Western thought. Now, he was born into an aristocratic family in Athens during the Peloponnesian War around 431 to 404 BCE. And this is super important here, guys, because Athens and its experiences form a huge part of the Atlantis story, as does Plato's relationship with his tutor, fellow famed philosopher Socrates, whose execution in 399 BCE saw Plato become incredibly disillusioned with ideals of democracy and morality. This was pivotal for the young Plato, who founded one of the earliest institutions of higher learning in the Western world, the Academy in Athens, to share his thoughts and teachings on the subject, which he recorded in the form of written dialogues, 2 of which we will be looking at today. The first is the Timaeus, and the second is the Critias, I think is how you say it. I'm going to go with Critias, guys, which were written by Plato between 360 to 355 BCE, when he was in his late 60s to early 70s. And the reason that we are focusing on these 2 in particular is because they are the very first mentions and the original sources of Atlantis. Now, this episode is going to be split into 2 halves. First, we'll talk about Plato's Atlantis and what he says about this famed island, where this kind of myth originates. And then we're going to talk about whether it is real. But first, I want to make mention, 1, of my outfit. Look at the cute little fossils. I come prepared. Secondly, I want to set a really clear timeline here, because there are some huge stretches of time between when Atlantis supposedly existed and when Plato is actually writing about it. So, like I said, Atlantis is said to have existed around 9,000 years before Plato was born. Just for context, as to how long we're talking about here, it's been 2,056 years since Cleopatra died. RIP Queen, miss you, think about you every day, right? Times that by just over 4, And that is how much time separates Plato and the fabled Atlantean society, which makes authenticating it rather hard to do. But guys, Plato was very thoughtful, and he does us a favor by going to lengths to back up the story of Atlantis by giving us his original source. So, in the opening lines of the Timaeus, he says, "He got this story, which, strange though it be, is yet perfectly true, as Solon, the wisest of the seven, once affirmed." Now, what the fuck does that mean? Well, Solon was an ancient Athenian lawgiver who Plato says received the story of Atlantis when travelling in Egypt, where he, quote, conversed with a priest at Sais, who goes on to tell Solon how that 9,000 years ago the ancient Athenians overthrew the power of Atlantis. For Atlantis was a vast island in the ocean, and her people were mighty men of valour. So according to Plato here, Solon, this Athenian lawgiver, is super confused by this. He's got no idea what these priests are on about. He's never heard of this island. He's never heard the word Atlantis before. And as such, questions the priest, who replies, "Solon, ye are all children in Hellas," Hellas meaning Greece, "and no truly ancient history is to be found among you. For ever and anon there comes upon the earth a great destruction by fire or by water, and the people perish, and all their records and monuments are swept away." So this priest is kind of throwing shade here. He's like, yeah, you wouldn't have heard about it because Greece is always being, ravaged by fire or some kind of destruction here, and all your records are constantly destroyed, so you don't really have any, proper great history, He continues after this, saying, "But in Egypt we are preserved from fire by the inundation of the Nile, and from flood because no rain falls in our land. Therefore our people has never been destroyed, and our records are far more ancient than in any other country on earth." The great irony here, of course, being that the Library of Alexandria, Egypt's great, knowledge bank, was literally burnt down by Caesar. But anyway, Solon, at this point, he's like, okay, fair enough. It makes sense why we've never heard of this before. As you say, we're always being burnt down or something's happening, so tell me more. The priest then tells him the story of Atlantis. Solon records this in a manuscript at some point before his death in 560 BCE, which Plato then tells us was left with my grandfather, Drapidas, and is now in my possession. So basically, Solon hears this tale, records it, gives it to Plato's granddad. Plato finds it and, expands it into his own work within his own words in the Timaeus and the Critias. Key to note here, again, I do love to come back to our timeline. Solon died 130 years before Plato was even born. So if you found a 130-year-old manuscript in your granddad's stuff right now, it would have been written in 1896. During which time Queen Victoria was still alive, the Romanovs still had their crowns, and the Gilded Age is still very much a thing. So while not impossible, this is, very, very rare, and certainly of another time, especially back then, which is where you get these fertile grounds for whispers and myth and legend, which begin to come into effect. Also key to note, I know there's so many hey, also this tangent, caveat, 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 but we have no record of that original manuscript by Solon. And there are also no other earlier or independent Greek or Egyptian references to Atlantis. So it is very difficult to verify Solon as a source, which means that everything comes back to Plato. So let's get into what he has to say, starting with the Timaeus. Now, Plato first says, "For in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles." So what are the Pillars of Heracles? Well, we know these today as the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, which were called the Pillars of Heracles during Plato's time, thanks to Greek myth, where the hero, Hercules, is said to have created the strait by splitting a mountain in two. So based on Plato's description here, we can gather that Atlantis is beyond the strait, placing it outside the Mediterranean, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Plato continues, saying, Now this island was greater than Libya and Asia together, and therefrom there was passage for the seafarers of those times to the other islands. Now, to us today, an island the size of Libya and Asia sounds fucking huge. But to the ancient Greeks, Libya was most or all of North Africa west of Egypt, and Asia referred to Asia Minor, aka modern-day Turkey, not the whole continent of Asia. So based on this description, if we take Plato very literally, Atlantis would be roughly 6.5 million kilometres squared, comparable to the size of Australia, which sits at around 7.7 million kilometres squared. So not quite what we think when we watch Atlantis or Aquaman and see this like little city under the sea, right? It's also, you'd think anyway, pretty hard to lose and it just go missing. Imagine Australia just like sinking into the ocean now. It's pretty wild. What's far more likely in this statement then is that Plato wasn't talking about Atlantis' geographical size, but rather using scale to demonstrate Atlantis' power and might. Or, as my best friend says, he's just adding some GST for dramatic effect, which, don't we all, like, relatable king here. Now, he continues in the Timaeus, saying, the Atlanteans were foremost both in war and in all besides, and her laws were exceedingly righteous above all cities. Her deeds and her government are said to have been the noblest amongst all under heaven. So Plato makes very clear to us all from the get-go, this is no ordinary civilization. Instead, he seems to be describing this almost divine, superhuman race, which he pretty much spells out with this verse. They are the fairest and noblest race amongst mankind, right? So we're getting a really clear picture here. There's this island. It's large, if not in physical size, then in stature, which is home to this incredible advanced race of people. But why? Who are they? Where did they come from? Well, for this, we are going to put a pin in the Timaeus and head on over to the Critias. So, in this, Plato tells us that this great civilization all started, for a change, with a woman and a crazed overprotective god who wanted to keep her for himself. Wow! So original, never heard it before. Crazy. So according to Plato, in this text, Poseidon received the island of Atlantis for his lot and begat children by a mortal woman. Now, for those of us not well versed in our Greek gods or our Percy Jackson, Poseidon is the ancient Greek god of the sea, and it is known amongst both classicists and historians alike that these gods are fabled to have frequently come down to earth and, have children with mortals, the result of which is a demigod. Hot. Okay, Plato continues on this subject saying he settled them, meaning these children that he had with this mortal woman, in a part of the island which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the centre of the whole island, there was a plain which is said to have been the fairest of all plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, in the centre of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain, not very high on any side. So pretty straightforward, right? There's a mountain in the middle of the island, which is surrounded by a flat, fertile plain. From here, Plato goes on to say, in this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor, and he had a wife named Leucippe, and they had an only daughter, Cleito. The maiden had already reached womanhood when her father and mother died, and Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, because, of course he did. Again, noting these children are demigods. But back to Plato. He says, Poseidon enclosed the hill in which Cleito dwelt all around, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant from the centre, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not as yet. Now, if you are watching on Spotify or YouTube, this will be far easier for you as you can see the images, but I am going to try my best again to explain for my audio divas here. So, what Plato is essentially describing here is a circular city made of a series of rings, namely land, water, land, water, land, water, and then this, Klato's hill, which is enclosed, essentially making this a fortress island surrounded by moats. I always think that's the easiest way to picture this. Just picture a bunch of moats. Plato continues saying, Poseidon brought up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold, and made every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. So he is setting his family up with the ultimate Shangri-La here, guys. It is perfect. There's hot springs, there's cold springs, there's all this food, which is really necessary because Poseidon didn't just have one child to Plato. According to Plato, he begat and brought up 5 pairs of male children, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions, he gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, and he made him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and he named the eldest Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. So, basically, Poseidon and Plato have 10 sons. They're all twins though, so 5 sets, 10. The eldest of which, Atlas, is the golden boy. He's got, the innermost circle in his mother's house. He's got the naming rights of the island and the ocean, while the rest of the sons are in charge of their own parcels of land on this island, which seems like a pretty hectic dynamic to share a whole ass island and not commit fratricide, but it seems to have all worked out for them, as Plato tells us. Atlas had a fair posterity and great treasures derived from mines, among them the precious metal orichalcum, which, pausing here for just a moment, was a real historical metal alloy, frequently cited in ancient Greek texts as having this kind of reddish, golden, browny glow, and at this point in time being second only to gold in value. So this is a huge resource, giving Atlantis what Plato describes as such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings and is not likely ever to be again. He continues, saying, they were furnished with everything which they needed, both in the city and country. For because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided most of what was required by them for the uses of life, including abundance of wood and herds of elephants and pastures for animals of all kinds, with trees bearing fruit, which the brothers used and employed in constructing their temples and palaces and harbours and docks. So this is, by all accounts here, an incredible place. It's full of natural resources and temples and leaders and, actually makes me think, and maybe this is a super niche reference here, guys, but did you ever play virtual villages growing up? I did say it was super niche, but it was this really early iPhone app, and you had this island and all these like little Sims basically who had to keep alive by farming and fishing and mining gold and building huts and stuff, which is literally giving Atlantis right now. So let's hear what these brothers did with their IRL virtual village. Plato tells us, he says, first they bridged over the zones of sea and made a way to and from the royal palace, which they built in the center island. So basically this big bridge connecting all those different land and sea rings we spoke about, so like a bridge over these moats, which leads to this huge royal palace which the brothers built, and according to Plato, was later ornamented by successive generations who learned great skills in design and craftsmanship to decorate the palace. Also, another side note here, this is just an episode full of side notes. I love how these successive generations have just spontaneously appeared without any mention of women to this point. Like, only these great sons of Poseidon have been mentioned, and they're amazing, and they built all this stuff, and they've got these incredible generations who go and improve it and carry on their legacy, but no mention of the women who quite literally bring them into the world. And we wonder why women occupy 0.5% of our historical record. It's dudes like Plato here. Yeah. So what else is in the city of Atlantis? Well, it's pretty much as we imagine it to be honest. With, as Plato says, an interior of the citadel fit with a holy temple dedicated to Plato and Poseidon, and surrounded by an enclosure of gold. And there was Poseidon's own temple, which was covered with silver. Within was an image of the god standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses and touching the roof with his head. First thoughts here? 1, it's giving Liberace, Versailles, Trump Tower vibes. And 2, this level of execution and scale and grandeur is wild and outlandish even to us today, let alone when this was meant to have been built around 10,000 BCE. Just let that sink in for a minute. 10,000 BCE. A time where the rest of the world, except for this one little portal of excellence, was locked in the Mesolithic Age. This is also often referred to as the Middle Stone Age, and it was a period where there were no cities. There were no states. There were no giant statues of 6-winged horse-drawn chariots. The real people of this time, according to history and archaeology, were hunters and gatherers. They lived in small mobile groups who not only didn't have agriculture yet, but wouldn't have it for another 2,000 years. So the idea that there's this civilization erecting temples and golden statues with royal palaces and bridges and moats is not only meant to feel superhuman, but genuinely would have been. And this is something that we will talk about when validating whether Atlantis is real or not. But for now, we're holding our tongues and we are just painting Plato's picture and building a foundation from the original source material. So let's keep on going. Now, I'm not going to read word for word from the Critias and Timaeus, although I do encourage you to read these, and I have left the versions I used in the show notes for you. But I am going to call out some of the key passages that describe how Atlanteans lived and operated as a society. So, Plato says the island remained divided into 10 regions with 10 rulers who were absolute in their own city and kingdom, where relations of the different governments to one another were determined by the injunctions of Poseidon, which had been inscribed by the first kings on a column of orichalcum in the temple of Poseidon. That's a whole lot of words. So, to break that down, Poseidon basically gave the original brothers rules on how to behave and govern and be good, right? And they were put on this column, and we know them because Plato records them here for us. So they say they were not to take up arms against one another and were to come to the rescue if any of their brethren were attacked. They were to deliberate in common about war, and the king was not to have the power of life and death over his kinsmen unless he had the assent of the majority. So it's very utopian here. And I do think that, at least for me anyway, a lot of the mysticism and legend about Atlantis that we all have lies in this advanced form of democracy and utilitarianism, which we today, and let's be real, all throughout history, just kind of marvel at. You know, we're all burdened by war and greed and death and violence, and it's near impossible for us to imagine this perfect society that lived in harmony for generations. But they did. With Plato saying, for many generations the people of Atlantis were obedient to the laws and to the gods, and practiced gentleness and wisdom in their intercourse with one another. So there's this real sense amongst these people on this island of harmony and respect for one another and the balance of what the gods have told them. Plato continues and tells us how the Atlanteans managed to do such a thing for so long, saying, neither were they intoxicated by luxury nor wealth. They knew they could only have the true use of riches by not caring about them. Guys, Karl Marx would be rock hard for this. I bet he read the Critias on Lonely Friday nights in the shower. Like, this is his shit. You know what? Now that I actually think about it, Atlantis reminds me 1000% of Wakanda. Like, you have this precious, super valuable natural resource, all this technological development, but there's no greed or attachment to it because it doesn't define them. But no great civilization, except Wakanda, rises without its eventual fall, and for Atlantis, Plato tells us greed and mortal sin certainly played a big role. He says, Gradually, the divine portion of their souls became diluted with too much of the mortal admixture, and they began to degenerate and were filled with all iniquity. So now, these divine Atlanteans who were bestowed the gifts of Poseidon become less divine and more human, both in the very literal sense, right, where the further generations pass, this divine blood from the original demigods becomes diluted, but also in the fact that the human sins work their way into these, perfect people forming sinners. Again, guys, this all sounds very familiar. It's giving Garden of Eden, it's giving Fall of Man. And this was thousands of years before the Bible was even a forethought. So truly a tale as old as time here. Now, the corruption of the Atlanteans' pure souls angered the gods, in particular Zeus, who Plato tells us wanted to punish them. So he held a council of the gods, and when he had called them together, he spoke as follows. Now, if you are on the edge of your seat, thinking, go on then, what did the big man say to his fellow gods? What's the tea? What's the plans? Please tell me. Well, prepare to be disappointed, because we don't know. The quote ends mid-sentence. Literally, the end of the whole Critias, done. Like, sorry, you're going to say Zeus is about to boom and belt his command at this grand meeting of the gods and not tell us what was said? Like, I hate waiting a year between House of the Dragon seasons to get answers to cliffhangers. Plato is giving us a 2,500-year cliffhanger here. Sickening. Devious behaviour from this man. But we do have some consolation back with the Timaeus, which may not tell us what Zeus was going to say, but does tell us what he did. So, Plato tells us here, now in this island of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire. This vast power gathered into one, endeavoured to subdue at a blow our country, and enslave the whole of the region within the straits. Now, pausing here, the country he's talking about, Atlantis going to war with, is Athens, so his hometown. He continues saying, then our country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. She was preeminent in courage and military skill, and after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the Atlanteans, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars. Now, for those of you paying attention, which I'm sure is all of you, to what I said before about the Mesolithic period, we have to remember here, Athens has no army. No one has an army. They don't even have buildings or agriculture or weapons or any kind of way to organize people, into a civilization. So the idea that the Athenians were armed to the teeth with the courage and military skill to take down this advanced race of demigod people in Atlantis is just physically and historically impossible. It makes no sense. So why did he write it then? Did Solon use ChatGPT for his research on Athenian warfare, which spurted out a pic of a guy in a toga with an AK-47? Or did Plato cross-reference his sources on Wikipedia? Like, why include this clearly factually incorrect detail, which largely discredits everything he's said? Well, that's a question that gets to the heart of Atlantis and has us come back to Plato himself. So what do we know about him? Well, firstly, he's Athenian, right? So that's a pretty clear bias to ignore the facts and fix the game in his home team's favour. But he has just spent all this time saying Atlantis is amazing, so it's kind of embarrassing for them to lose. And again, impossible. So maybe this isn't about fact, or history, or reality in any way, shape, or form, in case the demigods didn't give that away already. After all, while there were historians who existed during Plato's time, he wasn't one of them. He was a philosopher, a teacher, someone who, upon the death of their mentor, dedicated themselves to exploring the impact that corruption and moral disintegration has on justice and democracy. And what better way to show this tainted effect than with a story of greatness being defeated, which ends, in Plato's own words here, with violent earthquakes and floods, which in a single day and night of misfortune was swallowed up by the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared into the depths. So the big question then, is Atlantis a history, or is it philosophy designed to teach? Well, let's try and find out. First things first, just some really simple geology here, because contrary to popular belief, rocks are hot and we should defo study them. There is no geological evidence of a landmass of the size Plato claims Atlantis was, seeking in the Atlantic, and while there are similar cases, which we will get to shortly, which could fit this description by Plato, he's either wrong about the size of the island, wrong about the sinking, wrong about the location, or wrong about it all based on this piece of geological evidence. The second thing to note about this passage in particular is the language here. Notice how the city isn't destroyed or ravaged by flame, which we so often see in the ancient world. I mean, the Egyptian priest was like having a hee-hee about it. But instead, it is swallowed by the sea, which again feeds this very clear picture we have of Atlantis as this intact city that Ariel and Jason Momoa have taken up rooms in, right? Which is essential in this legend of these great people and this great city falling from grace, so much so it's wiped from the face of the earth. It's not destroyed and the ruins left there. It's gone and returned in whole to the realms of its maker, Poseidon, god of the sea. Again, it's all very cyclical and perfectly worded, too much so. Then, as I've so greatly harped upon, we have the fact the world at this point in time is in the Mesolithic age, right? We can't grow crops, let alone create a six-winged chariot that pulls a giant golden statue of Poseidon inside a temple in a city because cities don't exist yet. Then, of course, you have the element of the divine. These are demigods, of course, created by Poseidon, a race of superhumans whose island structure was carved out with a lathe by the god of the sea who gave them warm and cold springs with the turn of his hand. Now, obviously, the atheists in the room are going to tell you that's hullabaloo, but even the most spiritually connected Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus will say the same thing because, the Greek gods aren't real. That's just for Percy Jackson and Wattpad smutty retellings of Hades and Persephone. And that's, of course, before you get to the fact it's paganism, it's evil, false idols, it's sin. Right? The point here is that the spirituality of the Greeks with their many gods is largely laughed upon as ancient mysticism, and Atlantis, or at least Plato's version of Atlantis, is heavily imbued in this to its core. Which brings us around to what we think. Now, I personally do not subscribe to the Poseidon story. I also don't believe there was an ancient civilization around in 10,000 BCE which had these great capabilities of metallurgy and construction and trade and agriculture which was superhuman in nature. But do I think Atlantis was a real place? An island of ancient times where civilization developed great skills and artisans, living in harmony before being destroyed by natural disaster? I do. And when I asked you guys this question, you agreed, with 81% of you thinking the story of Atlantis was history, not simply a philosophical tool employed by Plato to make comment on the descent of man and democracy. But what do the pros think? Right? How do historians, archaeologists, and classicists look at Atlantis? Well, as I'm sure you can guess, the vast majority of them do not treat Plato's Atlantis as a real historical account, instead believing that Atlantis is either 1, used by Plato as a philosophical device and not an actual place, or 2, a totally fictitious island used for literary purposes of just pure entertainment. Classical scholar Benjamin Jowett sits in this first camp, saying the story of Atlantis was a philosophical myth and not literal history. He is joined by historian Kyle Hoekstra, who said Atlantis is a fictional island as part of an allegory on the hubris of nations. Meanwhile, 19th century Plato historian Thomas Henry Martin sits in the second camp, saying the location was not a real historical place, but a literary creation. Archaeologist Kenneth Feeder agrees here, calling Atlantis a pseudoscientific myth when treated as real history. And then all of this is just completely driven home by Christopher Gill from the University of Exeter, who tells us the story of Atlantis is ancient sci-fi. So, Star Wars for ancient Greek people. But not everyone agrees. In fact, there is a third group who, more cautiously, believe that Plato's account, while exaggerated, is inspired by real events. And this, one, is what I think, and two, I am really keen to unpack with you guys, not in the least because I actually did one of my history major works on this very subject, so it's a walk down memory lane for me and something I think you guys will find super interesting. So this camp believes that Plato isn't talking about Atlantis, but rather another ancient island civilization recorded by the Egyptians and destroyed by natural disaster, not the wrath of Zeus. Now, there are a few candidate islands and civilizations that fit this bill, including ancient Thera, aka modern-day Santorini, but the most historically accurate fit here, and my personal belief, is that Plato is talking about the ancient civilization of Minoa. Tell me more, you say, to which I reply, the Minoan civilization emerged on the island of Crete situated in the Aegean Sea, roughly 63 nautical miles or 120 kilometers south of Santorini, somewhere around 3000 to 2000 BCE, which places us squarely in a period known as the Bronze Age. Now, this was a time that saw mass population growth, the rise of complex societies, and advancements in tools, weaponry, and farming equipment as the use of bronze became more widespread. This, in turn, led to the development of trade networks, early writing systems, and urban centers with civilizations like the Minoans, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians flourishing, and in turn, laying the foundations for later classical societies like Plato's Athens. So from the get-go, guys, we're seeing a wave of technological activity passing through this period, which makes sense for the Atlantis comparison, as does the existence of Egypt's growth in this time, which gives far more validity to Solon's original story of the Atlantis tale coming from the Egyptian priests. Now, aside from this, the reason I and other historians believe Plato is talking about the Minoans with Atlantis rather than the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians comes down to a few things. Firstly, of the three, the Minoans were more advanced. They developed sophisticated art and engineering, perfecting craftsmanship in pottery and fresco painting that still to this day is regarded as some of the finest in antiquity. They were also masters with bronze and constructed multi-story complexes, the most famous of which is the Knossos Palace. Discovered in 1988 by archaeologist Arthur Evans, the complexity and detail of this discovery led Evans to believe that the Minoans were perhaps, quote, enlightened from above sources, with the palace serving as, quote, definitive proof that the king exercised suzerainty over the whole island and civilization. Now, if you're thinking, what the fuck is suzerainty? Then you are not alone. I'd also never heard of it, and it links to our second point of why I think Atlantis is ancient Minoa. So, suzerainty is different from sovereignty, even though they sound similar, with the former offering a middle ground where the suzerain provides protection in exchange for tribute, economic benefits, or loyalty. So less king/dictator and more official who is in charge of kind of overseeing the people, an island, and the resources, but largely kind of leaves them to their own devices, which, if you ask me, sounds kind of similar to a certain son of Poseidon who ruled over the central kingdom, but let his brothers take care of their own regions, which is point number 2. Like the Atlanteans' utopian society, the Minoans had a hierarchical but cooperative system which was advanced, organized, and initially peaceful. In fact, there's very little archaeological evidence of fortifications, almost no emphasis on warfare in their art, and no giant walls around Crete screaming, we're terrified of invasion because we're a warring state who wants to conquer you. Instead, what we see in the archaeology here is a society centered around the Knossos Palace, which redistributed goods that were communally provided to prioritize human needs. So again, Karl Marx, he wants a summer house here, like it is OG socialism. Or, in other words, a system where social stability meant you didn't need to stab your neighbor, right? It's all very Atlantean. Now, the third reason I think ancient Minoa is Atlantis is trade. So Plato tells us the Atlanteans were a dominant maritime empire, and the Minoans, same deal here, guys. They were the undisputed naval power of the Aegean for centuries, with significant archaeological evidence that they traded with Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Sicily, with Minoan pottery, art, and cultural influence found in all of these regions. This is also the view of early 20th century historian K.T. Frost, who was the first major scholar to argue that Plato's Atlantis was predicated on the memory of Minoan dominance in the Aegean as early as 1909, saying the Atlantis legend is a reminiscence of Minoan sea power. And you see the comparison so clearly when looking at Minoan maritime history, which brings us to reason number 4, the big one, in my opinion, which truly seals the deal here: the destruction. Right? It is largely the central part of the Atlantis myth, swallowed by the sea in one day and one night, wiped from the face of the earth. It's what makes Atlantis so enduring as a legend, and the end of the Minoans, while not as swift as 24 hours, isn't that different. So how did the Minoans come to an end then? Well, it is in large part thanks to the volcanic eruption of Thera, as we said before, modern-day Santorini, around 1600 BCE. Guys, this eruption is so catastrophic, it blows apart most of the existing island. There is ash clouds as far as the eye can see, and it triggers massive tsunamis throughout the entire Aegean. For context here, the Vesuvius eruption which buried Pompeii was a 5 on the volcanic explosivity index. Thera was a 7, with an added couple of tsunamis on top of that. So, we're not just talking about city ending here, this is genuinely a civilization ending activity. And we know for a fact that these tsunamis reached the Minoans on Crete, with radiocarbon data and marine deposits found inland, proving that the Thera eruption reached and wiped out large part of Crete's coastline. It was absolutely devastating. Imagine seeing this huge volcanic eruption, which, by the way, is still one of the biggest ever recorded in history. You have flame, you have ash, you have lava, and then a 15-meter wave comes crashing towards you. There is no realm where this doesn't seem like an act of God, and it sounds very, very similar to the end of Atlantis. So is it not obvious then that this ancient island that was swallowed by the sea by a horrific event is Bronze Age Crete? Marine geologist Nicholas Fleming certainly thinks so, saying submerged landscapes and coastal flooding on Crete contributed to the Atlantis tradition. He is also backed up by seismologist Angelo Gallinopoulos, who said Plato's Atlantis is a distorted account of the destruction of the Minoan civilization. Right there, plain and simple. And while, yes, the Thera eruption didn't instantly wipe out the Minoans like the Atlantis story, in fact, they actually managed to hold on for another 250 years post-eruption, it did erase large parts of their system, their economy, and their dominance within the region. So if you were, say, an Egyptian priest trying to describe this kind of natural disaster centuries later, you might say, yeah, the whole place just practically sank into the sea. See what I mean here? Historically and archaeologically, it all matches up. The only things, again, caveat city of this episode, the only things that don't work is the timing and the location. So let's go through them. Firstly, we already know Atlantis is said to have existed around 10 to 9000 BCE, whereas Bronze Age Crete sits from 3000 BCE to its fall around 1450 BCE, which, by the way, guys, just to preface, these are all rough numbers. We don't actually know for certain with events this far back in the ancient world. But even still, based on these dates alone, that's a 6 to 7,000 year gap. Which kind of a big deal, not quite like a minor detail we can just glaze over. But there is a pretty likely explanation for this, and it all comes back to Plato and that GST I was talking about. Right, we know this guy, he loves a bit of drama. So is it not possible that upon finding this old manuscript, which speaks of a powerful ancient island ravaged by natural disasters, he wants it to be really ancient and really ravaged, and as such moves the island back from the Bronze Age, where it historically makes sense, to the Mesolithic era, where it would actually need to be superhuman to be real. Again, remember, Plato wrote the Timaeus and Critias around 360 to 355 BCE. So ancient Minoan isn't really that ancient for him. But a civilization 9,000 years earlier certainly is. I mean, come on. It adds to the drama, right? The legend of Atlantis has endured for so long because it is so enticing. But historically, the timeline just doesn't make sense. Which leaves us with one last thing. The location. Because, as I said, the island of Crete is located in the Mediterranean and therefore in the Pillars of Heracles, whereas Atlantis is meant to be outside of the Pillars. This one too is pretty easily explained. Ancient geography, much like the ancient dates, tend to be pretty fucked. After all, let's not forget Plato is basing this story off a 130-year-old manuscript which was passed down through Egyptian priests over thousands of years, across thousands of languages and different cultures. So the idea that locations might get distorted, not exactly shocking here. This is largely the opinion of historian and author of The End of Atlantis, J.V. Luce, who says, the story of Atlantis is based on a real place and a real event, though greatly distorted. Archaeologist Kenneth Feeder also agrees with this about both the location and the dates, saying there may be a kernel of truth behind the Atlantis story, but it has been vastly exaggerated. So it is highly likely then that the location of outside the Pillars of Heracles has been mistranslated, and again, with all the history and the archaeology pointing towards Bronze Age Crete, you've got to make the judgment call. And to me, I think it is highly likely that Egyptians of the time, and later Greeks in Plato's time, could easily see Bronze Age Crete as a powerful island empire and the Minoans as an advanced civilization and wanted to record this. After all, it is pretty good content, which is exactly why we're all here right now. But there is a group who, for them, this isn't just content or a process of historical judgment to reach a logical conclusion. Rather, it is a real, effervescent fact. And I'm going to introduce you to some of them, including Ignatius Donnelly. Now, he was a Minnesota congressman and amateur historian who claimed in his 1882 book that all great advances in civilization and technology could be traced back to one place and one people: Atlantis. In his mind, this innately linked Atlantis to the theories of evolution by Charles Darwin, who Donnelly even sent a copy of his book to, which Darwin reportedly read in, quote, a very skeptical spirit. I reckon he would have gotten a big old kick out of this. Modern historian Mark Adams agrees, describing Donnelly as the first great Atlantis fundamentalist, in that he believed that Plato's story was factually accurate outside of the supernatural elements like Poseidon. He goes on further, stating that Donnelly knew the results he wanted and rummaged through his sources, searching for only those facts that fit his needs without pausing to note any reasonable doubts, which I know, I pretty much just did the same thing for the date and location in Plato's volumes, but guys, I think we've applied plenty of reasonable doubt here and have actual evidence to back up the theories of ancient Minoa being Atlantis, unlike this guy who just, believes it because he wants it to be true. Which, don't get me wrong, I also want it to be true, but facts must prevail. Other prominent figures who have held similar views in the years that passed included the mystic Madame Blavatsky, who in her 1888 book, The Secret Doctrine, tells us, quote, the Atlanteans possessed psychic and magical powers now lost to mankind, which, if you're a mystic, I'm sure serves pretty good business for you. But my favourite quote of hers is, the Atlanteans were a race of giants. So just a whole island of Hagrids running around out there in the Atlantic somewhere. Another very, very famous Atlantis believer was none other than Adolf Hitler. Yes, that's right, the moustached maniac had a great deal of his ideology rooted in the lost city of Atlantis, believing that the Aryan race were actually the descendants of these original Atlanteans. Now, when I first heard this, I simultaneously couldn't believe what I was hearing, but also everything made total and complete sense. Of course Hitler thinks he comes from a race of demigods whose lost city Ariel goes and shacks up in each night. Of course. Anyway, old Nut here believed the Aryans were superhumans who had lain dormant for thousands of years, waiting to come into their greatness once more as part of the German Volk, and was so serious about proving this that he created a squad of scientists and historians tasked with finding evidence to this effect, which included securing very old copies of the Timaeus and Critias by Plato. There are, of course, many other theories as to what other ancient islands may have been mistaken for Atlantis. And guys, I'd love to go into them all with you, but we honestly don't have the time. I encourage you, of course, though, to do your own research. However, I feel very confident that what Plato is talking about isn't just philosophical or literary invention, but a real island, the story of which was passed down from the Egyptians, who also rose in prominence alongside the Minoans of Crete and noted the eruption of Thera as the true source of their destruction, therefore planting the seeds for Plato's grand story of the ancient lost city of Atlantis, which has captured us today and those who came before us with as much excitement, skepticism, and wonder as ever before. But of course, I want to hear what you think. If you have other theories, DM me, comment below, email me. I want to know. Which brings us to the end of another episode of Hot History. Thank you so much, guys, for following along with me on this episode. And make sure to tune in next week because we are back with one of our hot take episodes covering the topic, do we have a right to destroy history? From Epstein Island to the palaces of Saddam Hussein, alongside the Berghof, copies of Mein Kampf, Queen Victoria's diaries, and the Romanov family's bodies. Do we have a right to destroy history because of what it represents, or does it all need to be preserved? We will find out next week. As always, guys, if you're looking for some more hot history before then, you can follow us on Instagram at Hot History Club and on TikTok at hot.history. It has been a pleasure getting down and dirty in time with you, and I will speak to you all next Friday. Thanks, guys. Love you.